My partner Nate and I negate the resolved. On balance, a one-day national primary would be more beneficial for the United States than our current presidential primary process. The con team frames as follows. The point of a primary is to test potential candidates to see who is best fit to run in a general election. Therefore, whichever team offers the best process to test potential presidential candidates should be the one to win the round. Contention 1. A national primary would exclude candidates. Rich Galen in 2016 points out that an even larger war chest would be required than in the status quo. Quote, if there were a one-day national primary, only the Clintons and others with influence could even think about running, much less put together a national operation to execute it. You don't have to have $100 million in the bank just to get a seat at the table, end quote. This means low-budget campaigns are at an extreme disadvantage, as Chapman from U.S. News points out in 2012, quote, a national primary with every state participating on the same day is a bad idea. A national primary would give a huge advantage to better-known, better-funded candidates, since only they would be able to finance the expensive advertising and large campaign operation needed to run a national get-out-the-vote effort in all states. Lesser-known candidates without extensive campaign operations would not have an opportunity to reach out. Densely populated states with higher delegate counts would become the dominant focus of the campaigns, end quote. Paul Osnes from the American Thinker expands on this, saying, quote, our factions need to battle it out before the election and then forge an alliance. In order to pick the candidate who represents the best compromise among the factions that make up a party and who also demonstrates the best chance of winning the general election, we have a lengthy, grueling process where each of the different types of contests, as well as their sequences, plays a role. Caucus states require a candidate to show organizational skill and the ability to attract depth of support. Placing an early caucus in a small state like Iowa minimizes the otherwise overbearing influence of early money. It allows candidates with small pockets and little name recognition a chance to garner momentum and support for later contests through the application of talent and effort. Eliminate these types and this sequence of contests for a one-day national primary, and the only way to win will be with establishment money and establishment infrastructure, end quote. Osnes proves that a one-day national primary requires more funds than the status quo. This will enhance the power of super PACs, which is an on-balance harm to democracy. Contention 2. A national primary is less deliberative. Subpoint A, a national primary would cut away time to decide on candidates. As Flanders from University of Michigan points out, quote, if we had only one day to vote and to decide the nominee, this would be a disaster for deliberation. Deliberation presupposes the possibility and the actuality that people will change their preferences, or at least better inform their preferences, if they are given information and time to think about that information. If the primary is just a one-shot affair, then the possibility of meaningful deliberation is foreclosed, or at least strongly curtailed from the start, end quote. Subpoint B. This deliberation is very good for finding the best candidates. Losing it is bad. As Schumacher in the U.S. News and World Report in 2012 iterates, quote, presidential aspirants must interact with voters and elected officials from coast to coast, learning invaluable things about our country and themselves. Iowa and New Hampshire are littered with the wreckage of past candidates who looked great on paper but were never able to get off of the ground. A national primary would render minority voters, interest groups, and regional concerns less important, while elevating the status of political consultants, advertising gurus, and super PACs, end quote. Furthermore, the status quo is very good at vetting candidates in a rigorous manner. As The Economist explains in 2007, quote, in fact, the primary system is working pretty well. America's presidential candidates have been forced to campaign for their lives in these unlikely arenas. Iowa and New Hampshire want their candidates up close. This imposes immense and immensely testing challenges. Money and organization matter far less than stamina, agility, and charisma. Anyone deficient will be found out. Anyone with the right stuff has a chance to shine, end quote. So a one-day national primary slaughters any hope for a campaign that can properly vet candidates for the presidential election. The primary system is not a government-sanctioned election. It is a process in which the parties select a nominee. So, we must therefore prefer the system that picks those candidates best. The more deliberative, the better. Because we fill these obligations, I urge for a calm ballot. Thank you. Is everybody ready? We have heard from Country Morning's platform system. The American University of Iowa explained in 2009 that the few states with early primaries build momentum for leading candidates while ruling others out before the rest of the country votes. Melman of the LA Times verifies in 2012 that since 1976, every nominee but one has won Iowa or New Hampshire, which holds the keys to the nomination. Knight of Brown in 2010 furthers that early states have 5 times the influence of late states, and candidates respond by funneling expenditures into them, which is problematic because Quartz Magazine explains in 2016 that Iowa and New Hampshire are very white. Their disparities in income and education do not reflect the broader electorate.
Matthews of Vox explains in 2016 that this disenfranchises minorities across the country, a process that's less representative of the electorate produces worse quality candidates. Knight and Brown, based on empirical data, concludes that the simultaneous system produces higher voter welfare levels than the current sequential system. Contention 2 is restoring representation. A one-day national primary would increase voting turnout in 3 ways, and the first is reviving voter efficacy. Late-stage voters are disinclined to even think about the election to begin with, as Cooper, the Christian Science Monitor in 2008 explains that plenty of civic-minded people tune out the election in later voting states because they believe there is not much of a reason to pay attention in the first place. Tolbert continues that individuals not living in the early voting states have a 51% lower probability of believing that their state is influential in selecting presidential nominees, which is critical for voting behavior, as the University of Essex in 1980 found that decades of research show that a citizen's decision to participate in politics is most strongly influenced by their sense of efficacy. Second is schedule simplification. Altshuler and Sunni in 2008 explains that the complexity of the current system leads to voter confusion. Surveys taken a week before each state's primary found that only 45% of respondents were aware of the impending vote. Third is holding back results. When voters find out their candidate is losing over the course of the sequential primary system, they often choose not to vote at all. A one-day primary would end that discouragement, as Atkinson of the University of New Mexico in 2008 quantifies this effect, finding that currently the overall vote loss is tremendous, reflecting millions of voters. Colbert concludes that a national primary would do more than any other reform to increase participation in the nominating process. The impacts to restoring voter turnout are twofold. The first is fighting extremism. Merkowitz of the Pacific Standard writes in 2014 that low turnout in primary elections means that those most likely to vote are very ideological, as the voters who feel compelled to vote in the primary tend to have extreme positions. Candidates strategically target these ideological supervoters. Thus, increasing turnout has a moderating impact on views represented in the primary, which is critical because the way nominees pander to the electorate during the campaign heavily influences presidential policy, as Wagner of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln finds in 2008 that presidents have fulfilled about 75% of campaign promises. Second is increasing political trust. Scheinman of Princeton University in 2013 explains that engaging in the act of participation makes the political world seem less foreign and causes the individual to feel more included in the democratic process. This inclusion can increase approval of institutions and the perceived legitimacy of the electoral process. She finds empirically that subjects mobilized to vote reported 10.7 percentage points higher levels of political trust, which is key because the OECD in 2013 explains that without trusting government, support for necessary reforms is difficult to mobilize, where short-term sacrifices are involved and long-term gains are less tangible, which is why the University of Florida finds that lower levels of trust are linked to declining support for federal spending in areas such as education, the environment, and even aid to cities. The UN concludes that political trust is the main motor of good governance, and for these reasons, Harrison and I strongly affirm.
Judges? May I have the first question?
Of course.
Okay, so you're talking about voter enfranchisement and turnout. What is your uniqueness argument that a one-day national primary increases turnout? Is this just that they know when they are, when the election's on?
I have 3 warnings.
Okay.
So reread all of them at these. The first one is that voters in later states often don't pay attention to the nominating process in the first place because they don't think that their votes will matter. Secondly, schedule simplification. 45% of voters don't know when their primary even is. Thirdly, if the primary is not close and the person who one would have voted for in a later state is not really in competition, they would not vote because they, again, don't feel like that vote will matter because their candidate has already lost. That's millions of voters. Yes. When you talk about how a one-day primary would decrease deliberation time, why can't the campaign process start earlier or just at the same time as it does today?
So the key thing about deliberation is that an iterative process, right? It happens over a course of time. Deliberation happens over this
Why is time
stratified.
shortened?
time shortened?
Yeah, why is there less time?
So we're not saying that we're eliminating like media attention or debates and things like that. We're saying that elections are key to this iterative process that we see in the status quo, right? Moving from election to election, seeing how candidates react depending on results is key to the process of deliberation.
Oh, so it's less about the duration of the campaign as it is that candidates learn about previous primaries.
Yeah, so deliberation helps both
That's
candidates.
different than but-
We're saying that it encompasses both, right? Deliberation both helps the voters become more effective at their job and the candidates as well.
But like, I'm still confused, right? If your link is not that the duration of the campaign shortens, how do candidates learn more from previous primaries? Like, what sorts of things would they learn?
Okay, so we see learning in how candidates react to elections.
How,
we
like,
see
what, like, literally, like, what do they learn? What would one learn from an Iowa primary or a New Hampshire
Sure.
primary?
So where they stand on policy, right? Issues of policy on a local level.
Yeah,
That's
why?
the learning that comes
So-
from elections because
Right.
candidates are responsible for discussing local issues in the status quo.
But that's like literally reliant on the fact that a one-day national primary would mean that candidates stop campaigning in states.
Sure. So we're going to extend this through the debate today, but what we see is that with a one-day national primary, deliberation and discussion about local issues decreases in an unbalanced way.
Okay, well,
right?
So
So
we're going to
this.
say that's a good thing, but like again, it's not. That's not necessarily.
So real quick, why is that a good thing to not
sure.
just be discussing local
National
issues?
issues affect far more people than local issues do. For example, now instead of talking about ethanol subsidies in Iowa, we'll be talking about things like the nationwide mass incarceration issue that we have.
Sure. So let's look to an example from this season's primary process, right? So Flint, Michigan, an issue that was brought up by our stratified process in the status quo. Those were discussed and helped to resolve by what we have now, correct?
Sure, but Flint, Michigan is just a part of a larger national issue. Are you guys on one?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you're right on the flow. I'll signpost for you to keep track of everything. Is everyone ready to go? Starting with our argument about the early state advantages, we have three main responses. First of all, from the Glacies in 2016, though these early states are important for establishing candidates' viability, they still leave out a huge pile of delegates who won on March 15th, April 19th, and even June 7th. Furthermore, Western Michigan University in 2013 points out that winning the caucus doesn't mean success. Some have lost the caucus but won the nomination. It really is a mixed bag of potential results. And finally, Boston University in 2012 points out the role of early state bellwethers, Iowa and New Hampshire, is in doubt. Recent analysis of what predicts Iowa mission success have painted the country to New Hampshire as small and Iowa as non-existent. The purpose of them is not to pick and choose who wins the nomination. It cuts out the candidates that are not serious, allowing for the debates to get more simplified and allowing for them to fight the remaining 4 or so candidates to fight over the delegate-rich states later on. It's a vetting process that allows checks and balances between small states who don't normally get a say, and also the big states who have the delegates necessary to clinch the nomination. It's a process that has been very technocratic in nature and allows for this sort of thing to happen. The next point on minority disenfranchisement. But in actuality, the current system actually enfranchises more minorities. Even in the face of a lower primary turnout in 2008, minority turnout continues to grow, from Jamel Bowie from Slate in 2016. If there's a constant result in Democratic primaries thus far, it's this. Everywhere black voters have had a chance to vote in significant numbers, South Carolina, Georgia, Virginia, etc., they've come close to or exceed their 2008 vote share. 2008 was the highest primary turnout ever. And just as they backed Obama in 2008, they backed Hillary Clinton by similar margins this year, delivering supermajorities almost 90% of places to her campaign. So those voices are also meaningful. What we can see from the 26 results thus far is that 2 presidential cycles of successful voter contact has had an effect. Not only are black voters increasing regular voters, but unlike many other Americans, they also seem to believe in their efficacy as voters. So the minority groups, the ones generally most disenfranchised in our society, believe in their efficacy, which goes on to the restoring representation and the restoring voter efficacy part. They're talking about the minority votes. They're the ones that are supposedly cut up by the very white Iowa and New Hampshire. They're the ones that believe in efficacy the most. So solving efficacy does not come by fixing the voter primary system. Next part is the idea of simplifying the system. First, we have one main response. The 2008 Super Tuesday was the closest we've ever gotten to a national primary. This comes from the Center of Politics 2008. It's called the Tsunami Tuesday for this reason. 24 states participated. But as Schumacher points out in 2012, this was actually so bad it overwhelmed campaigns, party leaders, and election officials, and they helped work together to ensure that this would never happen again. The one time you got 50% of the way to a national primary, the parties couldn't handle the system. So therefore, how can we possibly run a national campaign, a national primary system, if that's the case? Then the next big impact after the holding back resorts part is the idea of extremism and polarization. We're going to turn that from Buell and Meyer 2004, strong party identification is good for good leadership. The purpose of a party system is to provide us with candidates who represent a certain set of interests, not some random self-selected portion of the general electorate. This purpose also provides us with candidates whose positions are widely and independently known. When it comes to the general election, we want two clear ideological candidates. That's when you fight for the middle vote, and the middle vote decides which ideology is more preferable. The primary system is for the parties, a certain set of factions and interest groups and ideologies to fight over those remaining points, and then generally that polarization is actually inherently a good thing. The next point is the idea of increasing political trust. Trust is irrelevant if we sell our democracy. The Democracy Organization 2008 points out under a national primary, money will become the mother's milk in politics. And Fred Wertheimer furthermore points out from CNN in 2012 that primary, as elections get more expensive, PACs have more influence. Super PACs are gained for millionaires and billionaires. They're gained for corporations and other wealthy interests. Meanwhile, citizens are pushed to the sidelines to watch the corruption of our democracy. And furthermore, it is corrupt in two ways. It allows the super rich to buy influence over our elections and allows them to have influence over the governors. But according to Boston Globe in 2016, the status quo solves for that. Right now, super PACs have put a lot of money into our primary system with little to no success. It doesn't matter about efficacy, it doesn't matter about turnout. If the super PACs buy our democracy and pick and choose who wins the elections, none of that matters. That's the biggest impact in today's debate, and the con side is successfully right now in the status quo, reducing their influence and making sure that our democracy is not bought. And for those of you that are trying to calm down today's debate, thank you.
I'll take some prep time.
All right.
Okay.
Like 45 seconds.
Cool. Okay. Are my opponents ready?
Yes.
Partner, all three of my judges. Let's start off with my opponent's framework. They tell you that we should use the best fit framework because that's the goal of the primaries. But the resolution isn't about what the goal of the primaries is, it's about what's most beneficial for the United States. And I would argue the way that we weigh that is under the frame of good governance. Because good governance affects every single voter in this country on a policy level through everyday things like environmental concerns, like education concerns, and economic concerns. Those are the most important issues, right? Not just whichever candidate is the best fit. Ultimately, right, picking the best candidate doesn't matter if nobody trusts them to make the long-term policy decisions. That's why, even if they win their entire case, if we win trust for you later in this round, that's going to be damning for them. But let's go into their case specifically, starting off with their first contention. They assume that the current system is less expensive with the national primary, but they don't actually delve deep into a warrant for this. In fact, Caroline Tolbert of the University of Iowa explains that the status quo is probably more expensive because it requires extensive and expensive grassroots campaigning that goes deep into these early states. Comparatively, a national campaign for a national primary wouldn't attempt to sink in grassroots influence in every state because that's infeasible, right? So it can focus on lower cost, broad-based media tools like the internet to get its influence out, rather than trying to do what we're doing in the status quo, which is super duper expensive. But secondly, even if you buy that momentum for unknown candidates is possible, in any given election, a frontrunner is way more likely to gain this momentum than a dark horse, which crushes that dark horse's chances in the first place, right? That's why Hummel of Brown does a statistical comparison and finds that if a frontrunner's advantage is truly large, it doesn't make a difference if the system is sequential or simultaneous, they're going to win anyways. But third, even if you don't buy that, Sager in the Presidential Studies Quarterlies explains that unknown candidates are typically already weeded out in the status quo before the primaries even begin, through the invisible primary, where candidates without attention don't receive enough money. That's why you can ultimately turn this against them, because Kenneth Baer of Democracy Journal explains that a national primary would become an event that the media would capitalize on, creating a large nationwide campaign that would shine more light on each candidate. In other words, bringing out the invisible primary from the shadows so that each candidate is more well known going into the primaries, which is where the problem begins. But fifth, if money in elections, according to them in rebuttal, money in elections isn't even doing anything in the status quo, and they don't give you a quantification of how much it would go up under a national primary. So if you buy their rebuttal, they don't actually prove to you there would be any impact. But let's go to their second contention where they talk about deliberation. A couple problems here.
First, even you can group these, there's subpoint A and subpoint B together because one's the link and the other's the impact. First of all, even if you buy the national primary would shorten the time frame, campaigns don't need to be very long in order to adequately inform the voters and their preferences. In fact, Stevenson of Rice University finds, based on empirical analysis, that voter information is only harmed if the campaign is shorter than 6 weeks. And under a national primary, campaigns would still be way longer than this. But in Crossfire, they elaborate on this further, right? They tell you that we need to focus on these local, state-by-state issues. But I would turn this against them, because a national campaign is far, far better than a state-by-state campaign, because it focuses on issues that everyone across the country cares about, rather than trying to meet every idiosyncratic needs of states. National issues are much more important than local issues. They bring up Flint, Michigan, but that would have been brought up regardless, because Obama literally declared a national emergency there anyways. The primaries didn't shed a light on that place any more than would have already been shed. This argument ultimately means two impacts, right? And here's how we outweigh. First of all, a national campaign means that more voters are engaged because the issues that candidates are speaking about talk to all of them, right? That means they get more information. But secondly, better quality candidates are selected, because the best way to choose the highest quality candidates is based off of the broad federal policies that affect every American in the country, right? American presidents don't decide like the issues of every local or state-by-state issue. What they determine is federal policy. That's what they should be discussing in this campaign. But I would tell you that at the end of the day, even if you buy all of this, we outweigh. Because campaign deliberation doesn't matter if voters aren't engaged and aren't listening in the first place. And we link into that better in two ways. A, we show you there's expansion of media coverage. But B, we show you that people in late states tune out the elections entirely because they don't believe their vote matters. Both of those things are prerequisites to my opponent's argument matter. Have we done the first question?
Yeah, are the data's ready?
Yeah.
So the Media Matters organization points out that the Flint, Michigan water crisis is going on for 2 years until being revealed by excess media coverage started by the primary presidential election.
Okay.
Would this opportunity been created if it wasn't for a staggered process?
I would say it wasn't created through the primaries, right? Like when did Flint first become a big issue?
Flint first became an issue in the months unfolding near the time of the Michigan primary.
All right, so what also happened before the Michigan
it allowed for
primaries?
things to happen.
Hold on. What happened before the Michigan primaries? Before the debate in Michigan, that was 2 weeks even before the primaries. What happened?
The Flint water crisis was discussing the
What
Democratic debate in Michigan.
happened? Obama declared the situation a national emergency.
Yes, but
Before
furthermore,
we even had a debate in Flint, Michigan. Therefore, how can you tell me that the primaries had any effect on this?
because there was also more local government actions after that point. For instance, millions of dollars were given for awareness towards the Flint, Michigan process.
Why?
We also had a lot of the private sector stepping in, such as the Red Cross and some celebrities donating money towards the area.
When a president calls something a national emergency, those things are what tend to happen, regardless of whether or not there's a primary happening in that state.
So then why did President Obama give a state of emergency with the 2 years before when the Flint, Michigan water crisis
Because that's when he first detected it. Like, you can't prove to me that the primaries were the reason for that, for one. And second of all, I would argue that this one example doesn't prove like your entire case or the thesis of anything,
in our own
right?
case, we're pointing out about how regional campaigning allows the candidates to learn more about the states they're running for and also learn about themselves and
I
how
understand.
they can win over those types of demographics.
But personal
What other time can we talk about regional issues if not the primaries?
But, okay. First of all, I would tell you that the primary's purpose isn't to discuss regional issues. Does the federal government decide state and local policy?
They also have an impact on state and local policy and you have to win over those states to win the general elections.
Do they legislate for state and local government?
They step
Does
in
the
as
president?
certain actions. Well, you even said so yourself. President Obama had to know enough about the situation in Michigan to feel the need to call
But you
state
need the primary for
that.
that, right? Like,
The
I think
media
you're,
attention was
I think
critical,
you're
and the
missing
travel
out.
learning experience of campaigning across all 50
Okay,
states
on
benefits him
balance,
for that.
on balance, what do presidents have to deal with more? National policy or state and
And
local
the general
policy?
election provides the perfect amount of time for them to talk about national policies when it comes to those types of things.
But wait, hold on.
There's
Before
no
the-
other
wait,
option to
hold
give them
on.
a chance to talk about regional
But
issues.
here's the key issue, right? Before that general election happens, we need to pick the best nominees to go to that general election, right? And what affects the most voters in this country to pick those best nominees?
Well, every single person's impacted by the regional issues, legislation-wise.
But not every single person is impacted by every single regional issue. And you don't even prove to me that every single regional issue is discussed. Literally the only one you've brought up is Flint, Michigan. What about California? What about Iowa? What about Nevada? What about Utah, where we are right now? What issues have been discussed on local levels?
Every single state, as the primaries come to it, get a certain amount of media attention.
How
Utah,
much?
it was a conflict between Donald Trump and Ted Cruz. There's a lot of campaigning in there. In
Wait,
California, Bernie
But
Sanders
what
was
local
California,
issues were
about
discussed?
California
That's not my
issues.
question. What local issues were discussed?
biggest
What was
advantage-
brought to the limelight? Nothing. We'll be taking some prep time. Stop prep with 10 seconds remaining. Judges is going to be doing 4 points down the floor, but this is going to be starting to come back to. Is everyone ready? The first thing we're going to talk about is our money and politics impact. They simply drop the argument. We showed it in the status quo. It's then the Boston Globe card that Nate reads in his last speech that says, in the status quo, super PACs are being deterred because of the system we have. If you adopt a one-day national primary, super PACs and special interest groups have a vested interest in getting the candidate that they want elected, because in a one-day national primary, the person who has the most money at the beginning has the best chance of victory. So, if you allow this super PAC argument to go through, then you definitely cannot vote for the pro team, because money in politics undermines any of their impacts. If they want to extend voter efficacy or voter participation, all of that is undermined if the super PACs are determining who can win the election from the very start. This brings me to my second point, which is this regional versus national issue. The only side of today's debate that gives you an opportunity to discuss regional issues is the status quo. National issues are already solved by the general election. So my opponent's simply saying we should discuss national issues. Sure, they're important, but why do it twice? The status quo gives us a very clear opportunity to discuss local issues and actually achieve solutions based upon them and what the people in those areas need. The third point is the efficacy and minority vote. Again, extend the super PAC argument. Their impacts do not weigh if we have money in politics, because those voters, if they want to talk about enfranchisement goes away. If they want to talk about turnout, it goes away because it simply doesn't matter. If super PACs gain influence, this is the biggest impact because it inherently undermines our democracy. And the fourth and final point that we really want to bring home today is the framework and why it really matters. The only reason that we have a primary process in the status quo at all is to choose the best candidate. So we have to do what's in our best interest to choose the best candidates. If you allow for the pro side of today's resolution, you allow for super PAC investment and none of their impacts weigh. Is this the way to choose the best candidate? I argue not. In the pro side of today's resolution, you only see candidates chosen by a plurality, not a majority. If they want to argue for democracy and why it's important, none of these things are inherently democratic. The only way to solve for any of these impacts is con. Reject big spending, empower voters, and you must vote con in every instance to ensure that these positive impacts can weigh. Thank you.
Can I ask for one piece of evidence? The evidence that says that super PACs are completely deterred in the status quo.
Yeah. Yep.
The Boston Globe card?
Okay.
Was a minute and 2 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. Is everybody ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Start off on the first voting issue, which is money. Keep in mind they completely drop the terms that we read in rebuttal. Specifically, we say that the status quo is more expensive because it requires intense grassroots campaigning in every state, and there is a low turnaround rate between primaries. We tell you that because a national campaign can be conducted easier on the internet, and the internet is cheaper than intensive grassroots campaigning, that decreases the influence of money and makes it easier for dark horses. Their Boston Globe evidence is literally only evidence about this year, about how Bernie Sanders has done well versus Hillary Clinton, and how Trump beat Bush. But literally Clinton won, and Trump was rich going into the primary in the first place. This is not evidence about the system. We are giving you evidence about how a one-day system would be far cheaper. But second, we tell you that the media would shine a light on the invisible primary where candidates conduct intensive campaigning in order to, which weeds out candidates before the primary even begins. Next, on national issues. We tell you, they say that national issues can be discussed in a general election. However, we say that they actually say that it's, the primary is for the best candidate in general, and we argue that the national issues, when you force to discuss the national issues, you determine the best candidate on national issues before the general election in and of itself. Next, on where you vote for us, and that's our second contention. They drop our warrant that late state voters completely tune out of the election to begin with because they do not think that their vote will ever matter. They have a 51% lower probability of thinking that their vote will matter, and the University of Essex explains that efficacy is the largest determinant of whether or not you will go out to vote. This represents millions of voters according to our evidence, and we say that when someone goes out and votes, their political trust increases by 10.7 percentage points. Here's why that's so key. We tell you that political trust is the most important thing for long-term policy goals, because regardless of how, in order for long-term policy to work, a voter has to trust in the government. That's things like educational policy, environmental policy, and even aid to cities that pay off over the long term. That's the best way to link into good governance, and that's why you're voting for us today.
All right, you guys ready to grant?
Yeah, sure.
Judges?
So the majority of your impacts are derived from the idea that, well, a national primary be successfully conducted. We drop our argument pointing out that when we had 24 states voting on the same day, less than half of all 50, they were unable to actually conduct the election properly.
That literally has nothing to do with our contention.
So my question is, how can you expect these impacts to happen if the party can't run?
How does that affect voter turnout?
It was so bad that they were unable to do so. In fact, there was an example in which 60,000 voters in New York were unable to vote because
How
they
did Super Tuesday this year go?
Super Tuesday
this year was better
even
because they had less
So
states
wait,
voting on
so
the same
we've
day.
solved the problem.
So Tuesday was the first time that Super Tuesday had ever, 2008 was the first time that Super Tuesday had been conceived.
So, wait.
24 states tried it out, and it went horribly
Wait,
wrong.
so you're saying we shouldn't use a better system because of a logistical issue that we could probably solve and we have solved?
Because we have no reason to believe that they can actually solve the issue. The way they solved the issue was reducing the number of states voting on the same day. They staggered the process and allowed for the elected officials to not be overwhelmed.
So what was the cause, right? Just holding it on the same day made everything fall apart?
Yeah, having too many states running the exact same
Why?
day.
Wait, what was
Then how do we conduct the general election?
What was the impact on voter turnout?
It decreased, as Nate read.
Wait, what? No, you said New York. New York isn't even on Super Tuesday.
That was incorrect. The argument is that it overwhelms campaign.
If one single national election is impossible, how do we hold the general election?
The general election is run by the government. They have better infrastructure than the parties.
Wait, what?
So the primaries are
how
run
much
by
infrastructure do you need?
the primaries are run by the parties themselves. They don't
and
have
the
the
states
capital.
and
or
the
the
states
ability
actually
to
aid
elect.
like the running of the primaries, right? Like the states actually control the laws
And
surrounding
furthermore,
primaries.
you don't need to have two separate.
Wait,
places
also, you
to
still
hold
haven't answered the
primary
question. How many
elections.
people didn't vote because of this?
There is no number. It just says it's
All right.
overwhelming.
So
You said it overwhelms the campaigns. That literally has nothing
and
to
the
do with
party
voter
leaders and
turnout.
the election officials, the people running the election.
No, that just means that you're arguing that my campaigns had a harder time like reaching out.
I'd
to
say
other
election
people.
officials,
do it for the
people that
general
run the
election, you
elections
could
by
probably
themselves
do it
are
for a one-day
infrastructure
primary.
and They have to run it properly.
You guys
You
have
double
questions?
that, it's gonna be worse.
Okay, can we ask you a question?
Go for it.
Okay, when do you ever respond to the warrant that we give about why a national primary is actually cheaper?
Because it's not meritocratic democracy, that you can't earn your money through funds as you prove your electability and gain momentum.
That wasn't his question.
Yeah, that's the answer to that. Really how we respond.
No, his question was like, where do you ever like? How does that like outweigh the internal warrant that we give?
Because
for why
you guarantee the
grassroots-
election, it doesn't matter if this election is cheaper, whoever has more money to start a national primary wins. Our option allows people to generate more money over time and allows people to counter the influence of super
Wait,
PACs.
but
as we have seen this
generating
primary.
money
The
over
point-
time
the point
doesn't
that-
outweigh the fact that you do not need to do as much of that generating in the first place under a one-day
It
national
doesn't matter if you have
primary.
literally zero funds or not enough funds to begin with. You have to
Who
have an
has zero
opportunity to generate
funds going
funds
into
over
the
time.
primary?
And a long period of time in the Iowa
Wait,
caucus allows you to prove
who
electability.
having
and get
zero funds going into the primary
Bill
is
Clinton
going
made
to win?
$35,000 a year as the governor of Arkansas. and
Yeah,
over
but
time
he had like
generated
a
the
huge
funds
super.
necessary
He
to
had
win.
he had donors by the time he entered the primary. Like,
Is everyone ready to go? I have two main voters. The first of which is the opposition's impacts. The opposition's impacts are things like efficacy, voter turnout, belief in the system, and things like that. First of all, they're undermined by two different main reasons. First is the influence of super PACs. We brought up again as the election process go up, Bertenheimer in 2012 and CNN points out that it increases the influence of super PACs. In our case, we read multiple cards pointing out that as we shorten the time period for people to allow to campaign and increase the influence of initial starting campaigns, we increase the importance of political gurus and super PACs. It's in our case, we increase the influence if we have a one-day national primary. That destroys all of their impacts. If we allow the super PACs to buy elections, efficacy and turnout don't matter. The second is the concept of the Tsunami Tuesday. If the election officials cannot properly run an election, they therefore can't allow these sort of impacts to happen. It's all dependent on turnout. And if the election system themselves cannot actually create this to happen, then we'll have none of those impacts. The second voter are our impacts. First of all, you can solve for super PACs by voting con immediately. We've proven in today's debate that the status quo primary system is protected by the super PACs, protected from the super PACs. The super PACs are influential in literally every other governmental election. The primary system is one of the few examples of holdouts. The second one is minority efficacy. They dropped this point entirely in today's debate. We brought up about how minorities actually have a very important vote in our primary process, and furthermore, their turnout and efficacy beliefs are higher than that of their privileged peers. We're empowering the underprivileged in today's debate. If you believe in empowering those types of people, you're going to vote immediately for those impacts. So our impacts stop all the negative things from happening. The third final voter are the drops. The regional campaigning is important. We showed today's debate how that leads to regional issues being talked about. That's an inherent good. They agree. They won't have that impact on voting for one national primary. And then the turn on polarization. We brought up about how a primary system actually allows for this ideological discussion to happen, which allows for a general election that's between two distinct types of candidates, which is an inherent good. With those dropped and turn arguments, and the fact that we're protecting the underprivileged and everyone else from the influence of super PACs, we need to see the efficacy and the turnout coming on the con side, and therefore your balance. Thank you.
How much time do you think? Sorry? 10 seconds? Okay.
okay. Are my opponents ready?
Yep.
All three of my let's start off with the issue of money in politics. They frame this as the most important thing. Well, that's damning because we win it entirely. The first way we do is through the drop Tolbert's analysis that we extend for you in every speech that explains that extensive grassroots campaigning in these local states is far more expensive and thus forces these candidates out before they even have a chance to begin with. But secondly, we tell you that all the candidates that they're talking about are weeded out in the invisible primary before the primary actually rolls around in the first place. But we give you solvency for this because we tell you that a national primary would collect more media interest, which means that ultimately that shines a light on the process as a whole, which means ultimately we shine a light on the invisible primary, get people more known in the first place, which means even rolling into the primary, people have a better chance. We have the only solvency for super PACs and money in politics. They give you none. That's the first place that you should vote. The second place you should vote is off of the idea of national issues versus regional issues. At the end of the day, the president's job is to discuss and form policy about national issues. Our nominees should be selected based off of their views on national issues, not whether or not they like island corn subsidies, right? We tell you that is way more important, ultimately, to frame the debate in terms of national issues. That's why we win there. But finally, off of turnout, here's what's key. First of all, they tell you a Super Tuesday would fail, but under the same logic, our general election would fail. I say that works fine. Ultimately, there's no impact there. But they never really refute the internal logic behind our warrant, which is if you live in a late state, you do not believe your vote matters. You are in fact 51% more likely to believe that your vote doesn't matter. We tell you that that translates empirically to millions of votes lost in the status quo. And here's why that matters. Voting is key to building up political trust. Even if they win, even if they prove to you that they give you better candidates, those candidates mean nothing if people do not trust them to make the decisions for long-term reform. Ultimately, we access better weighing than they do. We win the round. That's enough.